On the surface, Mariah and Anthony looked like the picture of suburban stability. Their modest two-story house in a quiet Georgia neighborhood sat behind a row of trimmed hedges, the porch light glowing soft yellow against the night. Neighbors often waved at the couple as they came and went, assuming they were just another ordinary family making it through life together. But inside those walls, something unspoken, something rotten, was waiting to erupt. That evening, the storm rolled in heavy and slow. Rain drummed against the window panes, thunder cracked in the distance, and the hum of cicadas faded under the weight of the storm. Mariah lit a single candle on the dresser when the lights flickered, its flame casting shadows that danced along the wallpaper. She wore a pale silk nightgown, a gift from Anthony on their last anniversary. To any outsider, it might have looked like the perfect setting for intimacy. Anthony moved toward her, his tall frame casting a silhouette across the room. He smiled faintly, though his eyes carried a weariness that had become more frequent over the past year. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's been too long, baby," he whispered, his voice husky. Mariah forced a smile. "Yeah, too long." Her words trembled, not from desire but from something darker. Fear, dread she had kept buried for weeks. They climbed into bed, the sheets cool against their skin. The storm outside seemed to echo their rhythm, thunder rolling each time their bodies pressed closer. For a brief moment, Mariah tried to forget the secret, the pain, the quiet shame she had carried. She tried to give herself to him as she once did, pretending everything was still whole. But then it happened. A sharp bolt of agony ripped through her body. Her breath caught, and a scream burst from her throat, raw and desperate. Anthony froze, startled, and when he looked down his hands were slick, wet not with passion, but with something that made his stomach twist. He pulled back and stared, his eyes wide with horror. Lying there in his palms was not just blood, it was flesh. Pieces of Mariah, torn and lifeless, sliding from her body as though she were coming apart in his hands. Jesus Christ! Anthony staggered back, his voice cracking. "What the hell is this?" Mariah clutched the sheets, her face pale, sweat pouring down her forehead. Tears streaked her cheeks as she gasped for air. I didn't want you to find out like this." Anthony's breath came fast, shallow. He looked at his trembling hands, then back at his wife. "Find out what? What's happening to you?" Mariah shook her head violently, as if refusing to say the words that had haunted her for weeks. "It's inside me, eating me alive." Her voice broke into sobs. "I thought I could hide it. I thought I could handle it before you noticed." The candlelight flickered, shadows stretching across Anthony's horrified face. He could barely comprehend what she was saying. The storm outside raged harder, wind rattling the windows, as though the house itself was bearing witness to their unraveling. Anthony pressed his back against the dresser, his chest rising and falling like he'd just run a marathon. No, this doesn't make sense," he muttered, shaking his head. "You don't just fall apart like this. Not unless." His words caught in his throat, suspicion flickering in his eyes. Mariah sobbed harder, curling into herself. "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to see me like this." For a moment, silence hung between them. Only the storm and Mariah's broken cries filled the room. Anthony looked down at the blood and flesh staining his hands, his mind spiraling between disbelief and fury. Something inside him shifted. The horror of what he had just seen was colliding with a gnawing fear, that this wasn't random, that it meant something much darker about what had been happening behind closed doors. Mariah lifted her eyes to him, her voice a whisper carried on the storm. "It's not just me who's sick, Anthony. It started with you." The words struck like lightning. Anthony's jaw tightened, his face draining of color. He didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of the end, the moment their marriage tipped from fragile silence into chaos, from secrets into violence. And outside, the storm kept raging. Mariah's words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp and impossible to ignore. "It started with you." Anthony stood frozen, the thunder outside punctuating his silence. His eyes searched hers, desperate for some rational explanation. But deep down he already knew. Weeks earlier, before this night of horror, Mariah had felt the first sting. It began as an itch she couldn't explain, a rawness that seemed to grow worse with every passing day. At first, she told herself it was nothing, stress, hormones, maybe even an allergic reaction. She pushed it aside, the way she had learned to push aside so many things in her marriage. But the pain didn't leave. It intensified, clawing at her body, burning with every step. When she finally dared to look, she saw redness, swelling, signs that something was very, very wrong. She remembered sitting in the bathroom, the fan buzzing overhead, her hands trembling as she searched her symptoms online. Words leapt from the screen like daggers: infection, decay, flesh-eating bacteria. She slammed the laptop shut, her chest tightening as if she were being strangled. No, it couldn't be. Not her. And yet the signs grew worse. At night, when Anthony turned his back and drifted off to sleep, she lay awake, tears soaking her pillow, silently praying it was all a mistake. She had thought about seeing a doctor, but shame held her down like chains. How could she explain this? How could she admit the suspicion that had begun to claw at her heart? That this wasn't some random sickness, but something carried into their bed by Anthony himself. One memory refused to leave her mind. She had found a crumpled receipt in his jeans pocket months before, from a cheap roadside motel just outside town. At first she wanted to believe his excuses: a business meeting, a friend in trouble, any reason that didn't involve betrayal. But the lipstick stain on his shirt collar weeks later told her the truth she didn't want to face. Anthony had been with someone else. And not just anyone. Whispers in the neighborhood, late-night phone calls that ended abruptly when she walked in, and that sickening perfume that lingered on his skin all pointed to the same conclusion: a local escort who worked the darker corners of town. Mariah had pieced it together slowly, like a puzzle she wished she could throw away. The lies, the nights he came home late, the money that seemed to vanish. And then her body began to break. She wanted to scream at him, to demand the truth. But fear kept her silent. Fear of losing him. Fear of being seen as less than a wife, less than a woman. Fear of being left alone. So she carried the secret like a stone in her chest. She forced smiles at church, laughed politely at cookouts, and kissed Anthony goodnight, even when the taste of betrayal clung to her lips. But the disease was relentless. Each day, she felt more of herself slipping away. Her reflection in the mirror became a stranger: sunken eyes, pale skin, lips that could no longer shape a real smile. She bought heavier makeup to cover the changes, long sleeves to hide the weight she was losing. To anyone else, she was just tired. To herself, she was crumbling. And still, she said nothing. Because in her mind, silence was safer. If she confessed, she feared Anthony would leave. And then what would be left of her? She convinced herself she could endure it, that maybe it would pass, that maybe, just maybe, she could still hold on to what little was left of their marriage. But the body doesn't lie. It betrays what the heart tries to hide. And on that storm-lashed night, her silence came undone in the most horrifying way possible, bleeding out between them in the sheets. Now, with Anthony staring at her as if she were a stranger, Mariah's secret was no longer hers to keep. It was out in the open, undeniable, and it would change everything between them. Anthony's lips parted, his voice low and dangerous. "Are you saying this is my fault?" Mariah's tears shimmered in the candlelight as she whispered, "You gave this to me, and it's killing me." The storm outside howled, rattling the glass. Inside that bedroom, another storm was just beginning. Anthony's face twisted as if Mariah's words had struck him like a physical blow. His hands, still smeared with her blood, trembled at his sides. "Don't you dare put this on me," he snarled, his voice low and venomous. Mariah pulled the sheets tighter around her, her body shaking. "I didn't make this up. You've been out there, with her. Don't think I don't know." Anthony's eyes narrowed. "Her? You're out of your damn mind." But Mariah's voice cracked with fury. "I found the receipt, Anthony. The motel. The lipstick. You think I'm blind?" For a moment, silence swallowed the room. The storm outside roared, lightning flashing against the thin curtains. Anthony's jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. His chest heaved as he stepped closer to the bed, towering over her. "You're crazy," he spat. "You've always been insecure, always looking for some reason to blame me. You want to believe I'm a liar because you can't face your own mess." Mariah's sobs turned into a sharp laugh, bitter and broken. "My mess? Look at me, Anthony." She pulled the sheet away, revealing bruised, inflamed skin, the marks of an infection that had gone too far. "Does this look like a lie? You did this to me. You poisoned me." Anthony flinched, but his pride wouldn't let him bend. He turned his head as if the sight of her body was unbearable, then glared back with a look that cut deeper than any wound. "You disgust me," he hissed. Those words sliced through Mariah's heart. For weeks, she had hidden her shame, her fear, her pain, all to protect this marriage, to protect him. And now, instead of remorse, instead of love, he looked at her like she was less than human. Her voice broke as she whispered, "I loved you. I trusted you." Anthony sneered, pacing the floor like a caged animal. "You think you're the victim here? You think anyone's gonna believe that?" His voice grew louder, angrier with each step. "You're pathetic. A weak little woman who couldn't keep herself together." Mariah felt her strength slipping, but rage began to rise in her chest like fire. She sat up straighter, her tears mixing with defiance. "I may be weak, but I know the truth. And so do you." Anthony's hand shot out, knocking the candle from the dresser. It rolled across the floor, the flames sputtering before going out, plunging the room into near darkness. The storm outside became their only light, lightning streaking across Anthony's face, illuminating the fury in his eyes. He lunged at her, gripping her wrists, his breath hot and sour against her face. "Shut your mouth, Mariah. You hear me? Shut it." Mariah struggled beneath him, her voice hoarse as she cried out, "Get off me. You can't bury this anymore." His hand cracked across her cheek, the sound sharp and brutal. She tasted blood, metallic and bitter on her tongue. The slap wasn't just pain, it was confirmation. Anthony wasn't the man she thought she married, not anymore. "You ruined everything," he growled. 6 years of marriage, and this is what you give me? Accusations? Screams? Flesh falling out of you like some nightmare." His grip tightened, bruising her skin. "You're the shame here, not me." Mariah's vision blurred, the world spinning. She thought of the woman she used to be, the hopeful bride in a white dress, the young wife who believed in forever. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who had been broken, infected, and betrayed. And now, pinned beneath the man she once loved, she realized something chilling. If she didn't fight back, she wouldn't survive the night. Her voice dropped to a whisper, trembling but firm. "If you kill me, Anthony, they'll know why. They'll know the truth." Anthony froze, his grip loosening just for a moment. His eyes darted, suspicion flickering across his face. He hated her words because they were true. And truth was something Anthony Harrington could never control. The storm outside wailed louder, the windows rattling as though the house itself was warning them. But inside that bedroom, the real storm had already arrived, and it was about to break wide open. Anthony's shadow loomed over her in the stormlit room, his chest heaving like a bull ready to charge. Mariah's cheek throbbed where his hand had struck, the sting radiating through her jaw. Her body trembled, not just from pain, but from the terrifying realization that she was trapped in the same bed where their marriage had once begun with vows of love and forever. Anthony's voice was no longer that of a husband. It was venom, sharp and cruel. "You think you can drag me down with your lies? You think anybody's going to take your side when they see what you've turned into?" Mariah tried to crawl backward across the mattress, but Anthony's hand shot out, grabbing her ankle and yanking her toward him. She screamed, her nails clawing at the sheets for something, anything, to hold on to. "Stop," she cried, kicking frantically. "Let me go, Anthony." But he didn't stop. His face hovered over hers, twisted in rage, spittle flying from his lips. "You're nothing without me, Mariah. Nothing. And you'll never ruin me." Another crash of thunder shook the house, as though the heavens themselves recoiled. Mariah's heart pounded against her ribs, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. She shoved at his chest, but he was stronger, heavier. He pinned her down with one arm, the other hand gripping her wrist so tightly she felt bones grind. "You think you can accuse me? You think you can stand there and say I'm the reason you're falling apart?" Anthony's voice rose to a roar. "I won't let you destroy me." Mariah's eyes darted across the room, searching for escape. Her gaze landed on the nightstand, the drawer where Anthony had once kept the gun for protection. That cold piece of metal suddenly felt like her only hope. Summoning every ounce of strength left, she twisted beneath him, jerking her knee up into his stomach. He grunted, his grip loosening just enough for her to wriggle free. She rolled off the bed, hitting the floor hard, the carpet burning her skin as she scrambled toward the nightstand. "Don't you dare!" Anthony bellowed, lunging after her. His hand caught her shoulder, spinning her around. His face was inches from hers now, eyes wild, breath ragged. "If you touch that drawer, Mariah, I swear." But she was past fear. Something inside her had snapped. Her whole body screamed for survival. She clawed at his arms, her nails leaving angry red marks, then drove her elbow into his ribs. He staggered back with a guttural groan, buying her just enough time. Mariah tore the drawer open, her fingers fumbling until they closed around cold steel. The weight of the pistol felt alien in her trembling hands, but it was solid, real, something she could use to push him away. Anthony froze when he saw the gun. For a brief second, the fury drained from his face, replaced by disbelief. Then came the smirk. "You won't do it," he hissed. "You've never had the guts." Mariah's hands shook so violently the barrel wavered between them. Her tears blurred her vision, but her voice, though trembling, came out steady. "Don't come closer." He took a step anyway, his smirk widening. "Go ahead, pull it. Prove to me you're not weak. Or put it down and admit what you really are." The storm outside howled, the walls groaning as wind battered the house. Mariah's breath caught in her throat, the weight of years of betrayal, shame, and fear pressing down on her. For too long she had been silent. For too long she had let him break her spirit piece by piece. Now, with the gun trembling in her hands, she understood this wasn't about winning. It was about survival. Anthony's voice cut through the thunder like a blade. "You won't do it." Mariah's whisper came back, ragged and broken. "Try me." The storm outside rattled the windows as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Inside, the room had narrowed to two people, two shadows circling in the candlelit dark, Mariah clutching the pistol, Anthony advancing step by step, daring her with every breath. His smirk was cold, condescending. "You don't have it in you," he muttered, voice steady like he'd already won. "You've always been soft. Weak. You'll point that gun, but you won't pull the trigger." Mariah's hands trembled, her tears dripping onto the cold steel. "Don't come any closer," she whispered, her voice shaking, caught between rage and terror. But Anthony didn't stop. He raised his arms, palms open, as if mocking her. "Do it then, Mariah. Do it. Or put it down and admit you're nothing without me." That was when something in her broke. Weeks of silence. Years of betrayal. The infection eating at her body, the bruises on her skin, the venom of his words. All of it fused into a single, unbearable truth. If she didn't end this, he would. Her fingers squeezed the trigger. The first shot cracked through the house, louder than the thunder. Anthony jerked backward, eyes wide in shock, as the bullet tore into his shoulder. He staggered but stayed upright, snarling in rage. "You?" The second shot cut him off, ripping into his chest. He collapsed to one knee, a guttural cry escaping his throat. Yet he still clawed forward, his hand reaching for her ankle. Mariah screamed as she fired again. And again, the room filled with the deafening roar of gunfire, flashes of light illuminating Anthony's contorted face. Each shot was an answer to every lie, every bruise. Every night, she lay awake knowing she was falling apart. By the fifth bullet, he was on the floor, coughing, choking on blood that bubbled at his lips. But his eyes, those furious, unforgiving eyes, still locked on hers, as if trying to drag her down even in his final moments. She fired again, and again, 10 times in all, until the click of the empty chamber echoed like a scream swallowed by silence. The room was filled with smoke, the acrid sting of gunpowder burning her nose. Her hands trembled so hard she nearly dropped the weapon. Anthony lay sprawled across the carpet, his chest riddled, the crimson pool spreading beneath him, soaking into the fibers. His body twitched once, then went still. The smirk was gone, replaced by a hollow stare fixed on the ceiling. Mariah collapsed against the wall, the gun sliding from her fingers, clattering onto the floor beside her. Her sobs came hard and fast, racking her chest as if her very soul was tearing apart. "Why?" she whispered into the dark, her voice shaking. "Why did it have to end like this?" Her cheek throbbed, her skin burned, her body felt foreign and broken. But for the first time in months, she could breathe without the weight of his voice crushing her. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of what he might do next. Lightning split the sky outside, followed by a thunderclap that shook the walls. It felt like judgment, like heaven itself had witnessed the act. Mariah pressed her back against the wall, sliding down until she sat on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest. She stared at Anthony's lifeless body, at the blood seeping into the rug where they had once laid together in love. The contrast was unbearable. Her voice cracked in the silence. I didn't want this. I just wanted the truth. The storm raged on, but inside, all was still except for the faint ringing in her ears and the echo of those 10 fatal shots. Mariah wrapped her arms around herself, rocking gently as the candle flickered out. In the darkness, there was no victory, only survival, and the beginning of a nightmare that was far from over. The echo of the final gunshot lingered long after the smoke had thinned. Mariah sat slumped against the wall, her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking slowly. Her tears blurred the room until Anthony's body became only a dark shape sprawled on the carpet. The storm outside kept pounding, as if the heavens refused to let the night end in silence. For a few minutes, there was nothing but the rain and her shallow breathing. But then came another sound, pounding on the door. Police. Open up. Mariah's head jerked up, her heart slamming in her chest. She hadn't realized how loud it must have been, the gunfire echoing through the neighborhood. The neighbors must have called within seconds. The pounding grew harder. This is the police. Open the door now. Mariah's body refused to move. She sat frozen, staring at Anthony's lifeless eyes, wide and unblinking. The smell of blood filled her lungs, bitter and metallic, wrapping around her like chains. The front door crashed open. Heavy boots stomped across the floorboards. 2 officers stormed the hallway, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. The beams cut across the shattered candle, the overturned drawer, and finally landed on her. Mariah blinked into the light, her face pale, her hands still trembling. The gun lay on the floor beside her, empty but damning. "Ma'am, drop the weapon," one officer shouted, though the pistol was already out of her reach. His voice was firm, commanding, the kind used on suspects who might still snap. Mariah raised her empty hand slowly, her voice a hoarse whisper. "It's done. He's gone." The second officer swept into the room, flashlight steady on Anthony's body. "Jesus," he muttered under his breath. The carpet was soaked, the air thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder and death. "Step away from the gun," the first officer ordered. Mariah shook her head faintly, her voice trembling. I can't move." The officers exchanged a glance, then moved in. One holstered his flashlight and pulled her to her feet, twisting her arms behind her back. Cold metal cuffs snapped around her wrists. She winced, not from the pressure, but from the finality of it. "Please," she whispered, her words breaking. "You don't understand. He was killing me long before tonight." The officer's face was stern, unreadable. He guided her out of the bedroom, past the photos on the wall, wedding pictures, vacations, smiles that belonged to another life. Mariah couldn't bring herself to look. As they led her down the stairs, more neighbors gathered on porches, drawn by the flashing blue and red lights. Some clutched their robes tight against the rain, whispering in disbelief. Others just stared, eyes wide, as if the quiet couple they thought they knew had suddenly been unmasked. "Is that Mariah?" Someone gasped from across the street. "What happened in there?" Mariah lowered her head, tears mixing with the rain that lashed her face. Shame weighed heavier than the cuffs. She wanted to scream her truth to the world, that she had been betrayed, infected, destroyed from the inside out. But her voice stayed locked in her chest, strangled by exhaustion and grief. They placed her in the back of the cruiser. The door slammed, sealing her off from the world. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, staring at the flashing lights bouncing off puddles in the street. Inside the house, paramedics crouched beside Anthony's body, though they already knew there was nothing left to save. One officer snapped photos, another collected the weapon from the bedroom floor. The scene was a collage of chaos, shattered glass, overturned furniture, and the unmistakable stench of death. In the patrol car, Mariah closed her eyes. The storm outside had begun to pass, but the storm inside her was just beginning. Every shot she had fired still echoed in her head, each one a reminder that the man she once loved was gone, and that she was the one who had pulled the trigger. As the cruiser pulled away, she whispered to herself, so quietly that no one could hear. It was survival. That's all it ever was. The city lights blurred through her tears. Somewhere in the distance, The first faint streaks of dawn tried to cut through the darkness. But to Mariah, the night felt endless. The harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room flickered, casting a cold glow over the chipped table. Mariah sat handcuffed to the chair, her hair damp from the rain, her nightgown clinging to her skin. The storm outside had passed, but inside her chest it still raged, beating against her ribs like it wanted to escape. Detective Marcus Hill stepped into the room, a worn notepad in one hand and a styrofoam cup of coffee in the other. He was a man in his late 40s, tall, shoulders broad beneath a gray suit that had seen too many long nights. His dark eyes studied her, steady but not unkind. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, setting the notepad down. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the overhead light. Finally, he spoke. "You want to tell me what happened tonight, Mariah?" His voice was calm, almost gentle. Her lips trembled. She looked down at her hands, still streaked with Anthony's blood, dried now into brown stains. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," she whispered. "Try me." She swallowed hard, her throat raw. He brought it into our home. The disease. The infection that's been eating me alive." Detective Hill tilted his head, scribbling something into his notepad. "You're saying your husband gave you a disease?" Mariah's eyes lifted, shimmering with tears. "Not just that. He betrayed me. He went to her, an escort. I found the signs. The motel receipt, the perfume, the lies. And then I got sick. So sick I thought I'd die before anyone knew the truth." Her voice cracked, echoing in the small room. "I tried to hide it. I thought if I stayed quiet, I could save what little was left of our marriage. But then tonight," she shuddered, her body folding in on itself. "It came out. Literally. Flesh. Blood. Pieces of me. Right there in his hands." Detective Hill leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable but his pen steady. "And when he saw this?" Mariah clenched her fists, chains rattling softly. "He didn't care. He didn't comfort me. He blamed me. He called me disgusting. He hit me." Her cheek still bore the faint red mark of his hand, a bruise beginning to bloom beneath the skin. She lifted her chin slightly, defiance cutting through her grief. "That's when I knew. He was never going to stop hurting me. Not with his lies, not with his fists. If I didn't fight back, I wasn't walking out of that room alive." Detective Hill's pen paused. His gaze flicked from her bruised cheek to the terror etched into her voice. "So you reached for the gun?" Mariah nodded slowly. "He dared me. Told me I was weak, that I wouldn't do it. And for once in my life, I wasn't weak." The room went quiet again. Her words hung heavy, raw with pain and conviction. Finally, Hill pushed the notepad aside and folded his hands. "Mariah, I've seen a lot of people in this chair. Some lie, some manipulate, some play the victim. But you," he exhaled slowly. "You look like someone who's been carrying a weight too heavy for too long." Her eyes flooded again, tears streaming down her face. "I loved him. God help me, I did. But he left me no choice." The detective sat back, studying her. He wasn't the jury, and he wasn't the judge. But in that moment, he knew the case wasn't just about a woman pulling a trigger. It was about years of silence, betrayal, and a sickness that had destroyed more than just her body. He stood, gathering his notepad. "We'll get your statement on record. But Mariah, tonight might not define you the way you think it does." As the door clicked shut behind him, Mariah was left alone in the humming room, her tears dripping onto the cold metal table. For the first time, she had spoken her truth aloud. But whether anyone would believe her, whether it would save her, was a question that hung as heavy as the storm clouds still lingering over the city. The courthouse in Fulton County was overflowing the morning Mariah Harrington's trial began. Reporters clustered on the steps with cameras flashing, their voices rising above the buzz of onlookers who had come to witness the spectacle. To the public, the case wasn't just about a woman who shot her husband 10 times. It was about betrayal, secrets, and a marriage that ended in blood. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with anticipation. The polished wood benches were filled to capacity, neighbors and strangers alike craning for a glimpse of the woman at the center of it all. Mariah sat at the defense table, her hands folded, wearing a pale blue blouse that hung loose on her thinner frame. Her eyes were hollow but determined, as though she had already lived a lifetime in the months since that stormy night. Across the aisle, Anthony's family filled the front row. His mother wept quietly, clutching a tissue, while his brother glared daggers at Mariah, His jaw clenched so tightly it looked like stone. The divide in the room was clear, one side mourning a son, the other watching a wife fight for her life. Judge Harold Benton presided from the bench, his gavel striking once to silence the murmurs. Ladies and gentlemen, this court is now in session. The prosecutor, Paul Harrington, no relation to the victim, rose first. A tall man with steel-gray hair, he carried himself with an air of confidence that filled the room. He turned toward the jury, his voice sharp and deliberate. 10 shots, he began, his hand slicing the air for emphasis. Not 1, not 2, 10. This was not self-defense. This was not survival. This was cold-blooded murder. He paced slowly, letting the words sink in. The defendant had options. She could have called for help. She could have run. Instead, she chose to empty an entire clip into her husband. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not fear. That is intent. The jury shifted, some leaning forward, their expressions tense. Then came the defense. Carla Reeves, a sharp-eyed attorney in her 40s, stood tall at the podium. She wore a navy suit, her voice carrying both fire and compassion as she addressed the jury. Cold-blooded? No. What you're about to hear is the story of a woman who endured betrayal, disease, and abuse behind closed doors. A woman who was poisoned from within by her husband's infidelity, who was mocked, beaten, and humiliated when her body betrayed her. And when she finally fought back, she did so not out of hate, but out of desperation, out of survival. She gestured toward Mariah, who lowered her eyes, tears glistening. Ask yourself, what would you have done if the person you loved most turned into your tormentor? If the one you trusted with your life brought home something that destroyed your body, then stood over you with his fists raised and his words sharper than knives? Would you have had a choice? The courtroom buzzed, whispers breaking out until the judge slammed his gavel again. As the trial continued, witnesses were called. Neighbors testified to hearing screams and glass shattering the night of the killing. One described the sound of gunshots echoing through the storm. Another spoke of seeing Mariah let out in cuffs, her face streaked with tears. The medical examiner described Anthony's injuries with clinical detachment, listing each of the 10 bullet wounds. Fatal after the third, he noted grimly. The others were excessive. But the defense countered with doctors of their own, specialists who explained the brutal infection ravaging Mariah's body, the kind linked to untreated sexually transmitted diseases. They spoke of the pain, the decay, the irreversible damage. Their words painted not a picture of a murderer, but of a woman abandoned by the very man sworn to protect her. Finally, Mariah herself took the stand. Her voice shook as she recounted the night in detail, the slap, the accusations, the fear clawing at her chest. She looked directly at the jurors when she whispered, "I thought if I didn't stop him, I wouldn't live to see another sunrise." Her words cracked something in the room. Even the most stoic jurors shifted in their seats, their eyes softening. The prosecution fired back during cross-examination. "Mrs. Harrington, if your life was truly in danger, why 10 shots? Why not 1 or 2? Mariah's voice broke, raw and unfiltered. "Because after years of silence, after everything he did to me, I wasn't sure he'd stay down. I wasn't sure he'd ever let me go." The courtroom fell into silence, so heavy that even the ticking of the old wall clock seemed deafening. The prosecutor straightened, pacing a few steps as if trying to reclaim control. He jabbed a finger toward Mariah, his voice sharp, cutting. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, listen carefully. What you just heard was not fear. It was rage. Rage that drove her to keep pulling that trigger long after the threat was gone." Carla Reeves shot to her feet before the judge could even caution her. "Objection. Twisting her words into intent is not justice. It's cruelty." The judge's gavel struck once. Sustained. "Mr. Harrington, stay within the boundaries of testimony." Carla turned to the jury, her tone softening, her hands open. "Look at her. Does this look like rage to you? Or does it look like a woman who's been broken for years, who finally decided to live one more day?" Several jurors shifted, some biting their lips, others blinking back tears. One older woman in the front row lowered her eyes, shaking her head as if she could feel the weight of Mariah's words deep in her bones. Mariah sat trembling, clutching the edge of the witness stand, her breath shallow. She hadn't meant to sway anyone, only to survive long enough to speak her truth. But in that fragile moment, The room itself seemed split in two, those who saw a murderer and those who saw a woman who had finally stopped dying in silence. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. When the judge dismissed for the day, the weight in the room was unbearable. Outside, the cameras flashed again, reporters shouting questions, but inside those walls, only one question mattered. Would the jury see Mariah as a murderer or as a survivor? The courtroom was hushed the morning the jury returned. The trial had stretched for 2 long weeks, 2 weeks of raw testimony, photographs, medical reports, and words sharp enough to cut flesh. Now everything came down to 12 strangers who had spent hours locked away, debating whether Mariah Harrington was a murderer or a woman pushed to the edge of survival. Mariah sat at the defense table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore the same pale blouse she had worn on the first day, its fabric hanging looser now. She looked smaller, almost fragile, as if the months of waiting had chipped away at whatever strength she had left. Her attorney, Carla Reeves, leaned close, whispering something that sounded like, "No matter what, you told your truth." Across the aisle, Anthony's family filled the benches once more. His mother dabbed at her eyes, while his brother leaned forward, elbows on his knees, glaring at Mariah with the same rage that had followed her since the first gavel strike. The judge entered, his robe sweeping behind him, and took his seat at the bench. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." Everyone stood as the jurors filed in. They looked solemn, some with eyes cast downward, others staring straight ahead, their expressions unreadable. Mariah's heart thudded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She searched their faces for some sign of mercy, some sign of doom. She found nothing. The forewoman rose, a middle-aged woman with short hair and steady eyes. The judge nodded. "Madam Forewoman, has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor." Her voice was firm, carrying across the silent room. Mariah's knees threatened to buckle. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Every second stretched like an eternity. The forewoman unfolded the slip of paper, her hands trembling only slightly. She cleared her throat. "On the charge of murder in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant not guilty." A gasp rippled through the room. Anthony's mother let out a cry, muffled into her tissue. His brother slammed a fist against the bench, muttering curses under his breath. But the forewoman wasn't finished. She continued, her voice unwavering. "On the charge of voluntary manslaughter, we the jury find the defendant guilty." The words struck Mariah like a wave, half relief, half devastation. She closed her eyes, tears slipping free. She hadn't been condemned to spend the rest of her life behind bars, but neither had she been absolved. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Judge Benton nodded gravely. "Mrs. Harrington, the jury has found you guilty of voluntary manslaughter. You will serve a term of imprisonment, with eligibility for parole after 15 years. The gavel struck once, sharp as a gunshot. Mariah collapsed into her chair, her face buried in her hands. Her sobs were soft but steady, the release of months, years of pain. Behind her, Carla Reeves placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "You'll have a chance, Mariah. This isn't the end." The prosecution sat stiff, unsmiling, though Harrington allowed himself a small nod of victory. Anthony's family erupted in grief and outrage, their voices rising until the bailiff threatened to clear the courtroom. But none of it mattered to Mariah in that moment. She sat trapped in the weight of her own choices, the echoes of 10 gunshots still ringing in her ears. As the deputies approached to escort her away, Mariah lifted her eyes to the jury. Some of them looked back with pity, others with quiet understanding. A few looked away, as though unable to meet the gaze of the woman they had just condemned. When she rose, her chains clinking softly, she whispered a final prayer under her breath. "God, let them see. I only wanted to survive." The courtroom doors swung open, and as she was let out, the flash of reporters' cameras lit the hallway like lightning. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that inside this building, a storm had just broken one woman's life in two. The transport van rumbled down the highway, its barred windows rattling with every bump in the road. Mariah sat chained to the hard bench, her wrists bruised from the cuffs. She pressed her forehead against the cool steel wall and closed her eyes. The jury's words still echoed inside her, guilty of voluntary manslaughter. It wasn't a life sentence, but it wasn't freedom either. 15 years stretched out before her like an endless road, a road she never thought she'd have to walk. In the prison intake line, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, sterile and merciless. The guards barked orders, stripping her of the last shreds of her old life. Her jewelry, gone. Her blouse, replaced by a number. Mariah caught her reflection in a smeared mirror, sunken cheeks, haunted eyes, a face that barely resembled the woman she once was. For the first time, she saw herself not as a wife, not as a victim, not even as a survivor. She saw a prisoner. Nights were the hardest. The cell was small, the mattress thin, the air heavy with the sobs of women on either side of her. But what cut deepest was the silence between those sobs, the silence where Anthony's voice used to live. She could still hear him sometimes, the venom of his words, the mocking smirk when he told her she wouldn't pull the trigger. Even in death, he lingered, a ghost she couldn't exorcise. Yet, in the stillness, something else began to emerge, a fragile kind of strength. The weight of secrecy was gone. For the first time in years, she wasn't hiding anymore. The world knew the truth. Messy, tragic, incomplete, but it was out there. And there was a strange kind of freedom in that. Letters trickled in. Some came from strangers, women who wrote about their own abusive marriages, thanking her for giving voice to their hidden pain. Others came with judgment, words scrawled in anger, murderer, monster, you should rot where you are. Mariah read them all. She wept over some, burned others in the tiny sink at night. But each letter reminded her that her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to every woman who had been silenced, shamed, or broken by the ones they loved. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, her case continued to divide the community. Talk shows debated whether justice had been served. Was Mariah a killer, or had she simply snapped under unbearable weight? In church basements and barbershops, people argued her name as if it carried the weight of their own truths. Anthony's family called her verdict a miscarriage of justice. Advocates for battered women called it a wake-up call. Years passed slowly, marked by seasons viewed only through barred windows. Mariah learned to navigate the rhythms of prison life, the clang of doors, the shuffle of feet, the rare moments of laughter shared with women who carried stories just as heavy as hers. She wasn't alone in her suffering. That realization softened something in her, reminding her she still had pieces of humanity left to hold on to. One evening, as the sun bled through the narrow slit of her cell window, she whispered to herself, "I'm still here." It was both a statement and a promise. When her parole hearing finally came, she stood before the board not as the broken woman who had entered prison, but as someone forged in the fire of her own tragedy. Her voice was steady, her eyes clear. "I can't change what I did," she told them. "But I can tell you this. I did what I thought I had to do to survive. And survival doesn't come without scars." The decision would take weeks, but as she left the hearing, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a sliver of hope. Mariah Harrington's story never truly ended in that storm-drenched bedroom. It lived on in whispers, in headlines, in the lives of women who saw themselves in her pain. It was a story of betrayal and blood, of silence broken and truth revealed too late. But above all, it was a story of survival. For some, she would always be a killer. For others, she would always be a survivor. For Mariah herself, she was simply both. And as the doors of the prison closed behind her once more, she realized that storms never disappear. They live inside us, reshaping everything they touch. Hers had destroyed a marriage, a man, and a life as she knew it. But it had also left behind a woman who refused to stay silent again. When the gates finally opened, Mariah stepped into the crisp morning air. The world outside felt louder, brighter than she remembered. Birds cut across the sky in uneven patterns, their wings catching the early sun, and for a moment she had to shield her eyes. In her hands was a small cardboard box, the sum of 12 years, a tattered Bible, 2 photographs of her children, and a folded letter she had written to herself on the night she was sentenced. On the other side of the fence, no family waited. No friends. Just the open road and the unknown. A correctional officer murmured a quiet, "Good luck," before turning away. Mariah hugged the box close to her chest, her lips trembling. The air tasted of hope and grief all at once. She whispered to the sky, as if Anthony might still be listening somewhere, I'm sorry, but I'm still here. Then she started walking. Not fast, not slow, but steady. The steps of a woman who knew freedom did not erase the past, but who was determined to build a life that would not end in silence again.